He founded UN Watch 22 years ago. Our mission is to monitor the United Nations according to the principles of its own charter. It's what we'll be doing here when we look at the criteria of the Human Rights Council elections, and to promote human rights for all. Like our friends at the Human Rights Foundation, we're active throughout the year in giving a platform to human rights victims of some of the world's worst regimes. In the past year, we had our annual Geneva Summit for Human Rights. All of you are invited to our next Geneva Summit. Leon, it's the 23rd or 24th of February. You can go 23rd of February in Geneva. You can go to genevasummit.org. There's about 20 NGOs that co-sponsor this event with us. In the past year, we gave the Human Rights Award, our Women's Rights Award, to Masih Alinejad, the heroic Iranian journalist who created a website, a Facebook page called My Selfie Freedom, where women are invited in Iran to remove the compulsory hijab and to show their hair. That Facebook page now has more than 700,000 followers, and she's become public enemy #1 in Iran. She now lives here in New York in exile, and she received our Women's Rights Award. It was covered around the world. We also gave a Human Rights Award to Raif Badawi, the incredible young blogger who sits in prison in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, for the crime of having published a blog calling for a liberal society. He was whipped 50 times. The other 950 lashes in his sentence are pending, and he has a sentence for another 10 years in prison. We gave him our Courage Award. I've met with his wife 200 kilometers east of Montreal, where she got asylum with her family. She's an incredible woman. She's brave. She's courageous. I met her 3 little children. They are the most impressive kids you'll meet. And their father sits in prison, and Ensaf Haidar's husband. And we're working year-round to speak out for them. Others that we've brought in the past year are Lilian Tintori, of course. Her name will be known to many people here. She's the wife of Leopoldo Lopez, the jailed opposition leader in Venezuela, and many others. We're here today to talk about the Human Rights Council and the elections. And why don't I present the report and say a few words about where we are with the Council. Before I introduce the report, I want to note that about 10 years ago, actually it's 10 years ago now, Kofi Annan in February 2005 said the old Human Rights Commission wasn't working. Governments were getting elected not to promote human rights, but to shield their own records of abuse. He said some of the worst regimes were getting elected. It was rife, he said, this is February 2005, with politicization and selectivity, in his words, casting a shadow, quote, upon the reputation of the United Nations as a whole. One of his key recommendations of his proposal was to create a new and improved Human Rights Council that would be smaller, that would elect countries with the highest record of the highest standards on human rights. In big, his vision was accepted. A year later, in 2006, they created the Human Rights Council. Not all of his proposals were accepted, but some were. Now, when we talk about the candidates for the Human Rights Council, and when governments are asked why it is that some of the worst regimes get elected, their response is, as François Hollande, the president of France, was confronted by a French journalist here when he was visiting here a month ago at the UN in the halls that you just walked through, and you can see it on YouTube, and the journalist says, "Sir," in French, how is it that countries like Saudi Arabia are elected? And you know that UN Watch revealed last month that Saudi Arabia, not only were they elected 2 years ago to the Human Rights Council, but they were chosen this year, a few months ago, we discovered, to head the committee that appoints human rights experts. The 55 special procedures, the expert on women's rights, on religious freedom, on freedom of assembly, on independence of judges, that committee that chooses the expert, that selects the experts, that interviews them, is headed by Saudi Arabia this year. They were chosen about 6 months ago and then chosen again this summer. It was buried in some UN document, something that you weren't supposed to talk about. We did, and that story went viral around the world. Many of you heard about it, saw caricatures of it, because it is absurd and offensive and obscene and perverse to have Raif Badawi and so many others being oppressed by this, one of the world's worst regimes when it comes to any fundamental human right guaranteed in the Universal Declaration, and they are chosen to vet experts. And one of the newspaper articles, the Times of London, asked candidates, what was it like to be interviewed by the Saudi ambassador about what you're going to do as an expert? And they said, well, it was kind of surreal and bizarre to have that interview, as you might imagine. We then revealed a week after that, and this is probably the worst thing that I have to say today, and the most depressing thing, is that the United Kingdom, one of the leading democracies of the world, with all its flaws, had contracted in a vote trade, a reciprocal vote agreement that we discovered on WikiLeaks when they dumped Saudi cables a few months ago, to vote for Saudi Arabia onto the Human Rights Council, in exchange for which Saudi Arabia voted the UK 2 years ago onto the Human Rights Council. We only saw that the deal was proposed, but in the response of the British Foreign Office, they effectively admitted it. On Channel 4, Jon Snow confronted Cameron in a one-on-one interview. He said, how did we do this squalid, horrid deal? And the Prime Minister wouldn't address the question at all. But finally he said, you want to know why? It was like that scene in, what was the movie with Tom Cruise? You Can't Handle the Truth?
A Few Good Men.
A Few Good Men. Where eventually, you know, the character played by Jack Nicholson breaks, and he said, of course we ordered the code red. It was kind of a similar scene, and Cameron is being asked and asked and asked, and he keeps not answering the question. He says, well, we're against the death penalty, we're absolutely against the death penalty. And the journalist says, why did we make this deal? Why did we make this deal? And finally he says, you want to know why? Because we need Saudi Arabia for intelligence information, because there are bombs that could go off in England, and Saudi intelligence information gives us this information. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know. But the Prime Minister of England, of the UK, effectively admitted that they voted for Saudi Arabia on the Human Rights Council, which makes our discussion here very depressing. And then when François Hollande was asked the same question, because by the way, in that same WikiLeaks cable, it didn't get coverage in France, but the Saudi ambassador here in New York writes to headquarters in Saudi Arabia and says, we also have a proposal by France to exchange votes. And François Hollande says, well, don't you know, the UN is a dialogue for everyone. It's the forum where we all meet and talk, and this is where we dialogue, and we need to have them here. Guess what? That idea, which governments will tell you to excuse their horrid votes, it was rejected. It was rejected 10 years ago. When the Human Rights Council was created in Resolution 60/251, there was a big debate. Maybe everyone should sit there, just like here at the General Assembly in New York. All 193 countries sit here. Iran, Saudi Arabia, everyone. In Geneva, there was a debate, and the debate was decided against that idea. The resolution, and it's in the report, establishes criteria. Not everyone is supposed to be there. There is nothing here about how everyone is supposed to be there. On the contrary, the resolution says that members have to, quote, uphold the highest standards in the promotion and protection of human rights. They have to fully cooperate with the Council. And when choosing candidates, you are supposed to consider that country's record on promoting and protecting human rights. If a country commits gross and systematic violations under Article 8 of the 2006 resolution, we can suspend that country. It happened miraculously to Libya. After they were elected in May 2010, then there was the war, and 6 months later, they were suspended. The idea that François Hollande and others would like you to believe that everyone is welcome, and that's the way it was meant to be, is false. That is not the way it was meant to be. Countries were supposed to meet standards, and if they fail the standards, they can and should be suspended. And therefore, we meet today to ask of the candidates who have presented their nomination for tomorrow's election, who meets those standards. And there is an election. And the countries you have before you, we have a list of qualified countries. It doesn't mean they're perfect, but it means based on the criteria of how they treat their citizens at home, what is their human rights record at home, how they treat women, how they treat minorities, how they treat freedom of religion, and how they use their UN votes. It's not enough to have a good human rights record at home. What will they do with their vote at the Human Rights Council? And we've listed 9 countries that fail to meet the minimal standards. Burundi, which has committed very gross violence in the past month, killed an aid worker, their police killed an aid worker and a prominent journalist and a human rights activist in August. Burundi, by the way, together with Ethiopia, on page 1 of the report, belong to closed slates. It means it's uncontested in the African group, meaning it's almost guaranteed that Burundi and Ethiopia will be elected. It need not be the case, but almost guaranteed. Ecuador, so Burundi, Ecuador, Ethiopia, Kyrgyzstan, Laos, Pakistan, Togo, the UAE, and Venezuela. These are countries, as our report documents, which fail to respect the human rights of their own citizens and have either negative or nearly entirely negative records on human rights resolutions.